the fun part of it. Will Facebook Live work today? Some days it works great, and some days not at all.
I can record it on the local computer just so that it's there for later.
Well, I'm recording it as well.
Okay.
So we are actually recording already. Let me, ooh, it looks like it's gonna work. Yeah, I can tell my technology is not great. Alrighty, but I'm gonna go ahead and do my quick little introduction while I get this going. So welcome everybody. Again, my name is Stacy. I'm the Executive Director here at Bucks County Audubon Society. And welcome to our Nature in Your Backyard Lunch and Learn series. We're almost done. These programs have been great. People have been really receiving them well. So we're very excited about that. So today we are learning all about herbaceous plants, and then we have one more after this week where we're going to be learning all about fungus and lichen, which I'm really excited about because I know even less about that. So that's exciting to me. But hopefully everyone's been enjoying these. I also want to give a shout out to our Bio Blitz, which is going to be the event coming up. We're doing it socially distanced between October 18th and the 24th. So you can come out at any point during that time to sort of help us count the flora and fauna at Honey Hollow around Bucks Audubon. So hopefully people can sign up for that. I know there's been some glitches on the sign up for the website, but I think it's all fixed now. So please sign up and somebody will be in touch, either myself or probably Diane Smith, our Director of Education, to sort of let you know where you're going to be for the Bio Blitz, where you're going to be positioned and what you're going to do. We'll base it on sort of what you feel like your knowledge level is. So we're really excited about that. So yeah, so we've got lots going on. We have, as I said, we have one more after this. Then we're going to take a week off so we can all do our Bio Blitz. And then we're starting a new Lunch and Learn series on October 28th. That's going to be all about sustainability, which will be really cool. It'll be a 6-week Lunch and Learn series as well. So more information will be coming out about that. And remember, if you missed something today or want to rewatch it, it will be available up on our YouTube channel, probably in another day or so, once Marissa gets it all set up. So, alrighty, I'm going to stop talking now and I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and let her take it away.
All right, welcome everybody. I'm really happy to see some friendly faces and some new people here. So I'm Sarah Doley. I teach in the plant science department at Delaware Valley University, and I actually teach the crop seed plant production classes related to agriculture. And I'm relatively new to the Mid-Atlantic area. I moved back here 3 years ago after being in California. So part of what I do for work is weed identification in farmers' fields and in turf areas because those are pests in that production area. And so that is the angle that I came at it from. However, I'm totally fascinated by nature and the plants that are growing in our regular ecosystem and natural spaces. And I think that we could transition agriculture to serve more of those ecosystem services, then we'll have a more sustainable agriculture future and just really positive environmental outlook going forward. Okay, so that being said, I have only been studying plants for 10 years and I'm not a botanist. So when the Bucks Audubon said we would like somebody to give an introduction on plant identification, I thought, hey, I can do that because plant identification is new to me. I am still a beginner myself. So hopefully this will demystify plants for some people and help people to be less plant blind. Okay, so one of the classes I teach here at Del Val is feed grains and forage. It's the students are primarily ag business and animal science majors, so it is their first plant class. And to them, what they see as plants, it is either grass or a tree. Right, so today's talk is going to focus on those plants that would fall into what people who are plant blind would consider grasses. Let me see. So hopefully we all learn a little bit of something. It's not too disorganized. And teaching plant ID in person is one of my favorite things. Teaching plant ID on Zoom is not, but that's what we're doing because we're all staying safe. So, all right, so to get started, I'm going to show you some of the books I was using as resources, and that is what I recommend all of you use. There are great phone apps for IDing plants, and don't be afraid to use those. But where I start is with weeds of the Northeast. And weeds are in the eye of the beholder, right? So weed is anything that's growing where you don't want it to grow. But weeds can be doing amazing things for the environment at the same time. They can be feeding pollinators, they can be holding soil in place, some of them are edible. But what I like about the Weeds of the Northeast book is that it is targeted towards non-botanists. So the glossary of plant parts is anatomy is not overwhelming. And the dichotomous key at the front, which we'll go over later, hopefully successfully, which is how you key out what plants you're looking at, is written for a field practitioner rather than a botanist, so it's a great introductory. And then when you get good at getting down to the genus of what the weed is, and it covers a lot of the common plants in the mid-Atlantic, but it's more the plants that grow in disturbed areas. So those that grow in turf, in home gardens, in agriculture fields, along roadsides, on the periphery of the woods, right? So not the thick native areas. But if you have an idea of what you're looking for from the Weeds of the Northeast, which is easier to use, then you can move into this beautiful book that's more complete, The Plants of Pennsylvania by Ann Fowler Rhodes and Timothy Block. The glossary and the anatomy terms are just a little bit more challenging there. They get more specific, and it's a beautiful book. Okay. All right, so I'm going to dive in. Let's see, got a question? Oh, why, thank you. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Pull up the oh so valuable PowerPoint. And switch to. All right, so thumbs up, you can see this, right, Elaine? Great. All right, so Honey Hollow, beautiful place. We hope that you come out and do some plant ID here at Honey Hollow, but feel free to do it in your own yard or anywhere you're at. Hopefully the more plants you recognize, the more beautiful your environment will become. Today's Nature in Your Backyard series, we're focusing on plants. And what plants are here is everything behind what's in the front of the picture. Right? So plants are really what is supporting our natural ecosystems. So we have a clover, a beautiful white clover, legume, nitrogen fixer in front of our turtle. We've got some dead wood underneath our fox. We've got some moss underneath the line, a stem behind our dragonfly, and a echinacea or coneflower behind our swallowtail. And so I get really excited about plants, and I hope you do too. Probably because you're watching an online video of plants, because of their ability to photosynthesize. So plants are what are responsible for turning the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, energy from the sun, into carbon hydrogen chains, which are our sugars, our fibers, our fuels, everything that powers, clothes, shelters the rest of life on Earth. And that's really powerful, but they're not in it alone. Then we have our insects, our animals, our bacteria, our microbes, which then cycle those carbon hydrogen chains through life and may release them back into the atmosphere. And that whole cycle and that balance and that variation is what makes this world so beautiful. So today, October 7th, we're talking about herbaceous, which are the non-woody plants. Think of herbs, soft plants, right? So they have less lignified tissue. So I have up here a few common herbaceous plants, which you would see in this form this time of year. On your left is a goldenrod. In the middle is giant ragweed, and on the right is dandelion. So I think dandelion, that one people are familiar with because it grants wishes when you're a kid. So that's a great way to know dandelions, right? And what it is the seed head with this great white tuft that's used for dispersing the seeds. In the middle, ragweed. Ragweed is actually the plant that we can blame for hay fever, which is a great problem for people who have allergies at this time of year. And it's caused by the wind transferred pollen that's produced by ragweed in copious amounts, and it's just a super aggravating form of pollen. So ragweed is what we can blame for hay fever. This is giant ragweed. And then on the left, goldenrod. Goldenrod has been notoriously blamed for hay fever, but it is not what is to blame. Goldenrod is flowering this time of year. It's feeding a whole lot of important pollinators.
Yep.
And yes. It has evolved with insect pollinators, so it has a large pollen grain that is not wind dispersed, so it is not disturbing your respiratory system the way that wind dispersed ragweed pollen would be. So if you have goldenrod on the edge of your property, let it grow. Love it, admire it, go check it out and see what insects are there living with it, right? So goldenrod is great. Ragweed has its place, but if you're having allergies, you can be mad at it. All right, so starting all the way at the back, I could not help myself with plant evolution. So what we were talking, so plants so all plants that we know come from a common ancestor. That's how evolution works, right? So about 600 million years ago, there was an ancestral green algae photosynthesizing in the water. Didn't have the structure that plants have today, but it was photosynthesizing. Eventually, it developed a little bit more structure so that those plants could come onto land around 500 million years ago, right? And that gives us our mosses, which are really tiny, our bryophytes, right? And then plants evolved more developed vascular systems so they could move water throughout the plant. And that brings us to our ferns. So ferns are pretty ancient too, but not as ancient as the mosses. After that, plants developed a little bit further, and they have developed the ability to form seeds. And developing the ability to form seeds, at every step of plant evolution has been pretty magnificent in the fact that it's allowed plants to colonize areas of the globe that they weren't able to colonize before. And when a plant colonizes rocks, it helps to break it down, it adds other nutrients there. It's quite miraculous. Okay, but seeds are really easy for us to get excited about now, the ability for plants to make seeds, because we as humans base a lot of our economy around it, right? Seeds provide, there are grains, right? Our corn, our rice, our wheat, our beans, those are all seeds, right? And seeds are what hold the next generation of the plant. So in a very secure, durable, weather resistance form. So once plants were able to develop seeds, those seeds could be dispersed further and lay in a dormant state through harsh winters or dry summers, which allowed plants to then live in even broader systems, right? And so those seed plants, which include the gymnosperms, further developed into the angiosperms, which are flowering seeded plants, right? And so a pine tree, yes, it makes seeds and little pine cones, but they're not really decorative. They are, the pollen is dispersed by wind. And then with angiosperms and the evolution of flowers co-evolved then with pollinators, with all the insects, the birds, the bats, the other critters that move pollen around from flower to flower. And so there was this just beautiful co-evolution that started with our angiosperms. And that is, so when we're talking about herbaceous plants, that could include any of those land plants that aren't super woody, but we're gonna focus today mostly on the angiosperms, but feel free to ask questions about ferns or bryophytes, or I probably won't know the answer, but I like questions anyway. All right. So started evolution, I'll talk a little bit more about plant evolution and speciation, which I'm really excited about. Okay, so my background before I started teaching crop production was I studied plant breeding and genetics to try to make lima beans more insect resistant for California farmers. Kind of niche, but the general idea is that if you can match genetics that have evolved for 600 million years in plants into, if you can match the genetics with the environment, then you can grow things more sustainably. And that's what I'm really excited about. And whether that's happening in a cultivated system or in a wild system, matching genetics to the environment is neat. So this idea of speciation and how that occurs, we're going to talk about today because I got to pick what we're talking about. I'll go into a little plant and flower anatomy. I'm not trying to sink anyone in vocabulary. They are terms that you should look up later, but that's it. We'll do a brief identification and I'll show you some common plants that you'll see flowering right now here in Pennsylvania. All right, so evolution. We all think of Darwin, right? But Darwin didn't come up with the idea of evolution out of nowhere. There were many great minds and experiences that happened before him that that he helped to put together and get some credit for. So one of those great thinkers was Alexander von Humboldt, who traveled the world in the late 1700s. At the time of his life, he was one of the most influential thinkers. And people of the time, he was friends with Jefferson and Simone Bolivar and poets and artists. And one of the things that Alexander von Humboldt did was, with some Native Americans, he attempted to climb Mount Chimborazo. And as he was walking up Mount Chimborazo, and this is a artistic image of his experience, he noticed that there were different ecozones, different plant communities at each of the elevations. Right. So he realized, he noted, and he had noted this on other mountains that he had climbed, that there is some sort of environmental condition that changes what can live there. And that variation maybe on this mountain is different than another mountain, but some of those things are also similar. Something I really liked about Alexander von Humboldt, besides these discrete observations and measurements of nature, is he felt that to truly understand nature, you needed to experience it. You needed to love it. You needed to enjoy it. You needed to like be carried away by it, not just take the measurements. So he thought that the full nature experience included the data, the quantitative data, as well as the actual experience. Checking chats, okay. So Alexander von Humboldt, very influential during his time. He was also into educating women and giving free lectures and all this very progressive thinking. So if you get a chance to read The Invention of Nature by Wolff, I can't remember her first name, about Alexander von Humboldt, it's Andrea Wolff, it's fantastic. Okay, so von Humboldt, he was one of the big inspirations to Darwin. When Darwin was on the Beagle, he was doing his first and only international journey. He read von Humboldt's work and thought, hey, maybe this like pre-evolution idea that he's putting together and that my dad worked on, maybe there's something to it. So Darwin sketched out his tree of life, right? Where we have a common ancestor and then mutations or something happens and we get some variation, and from that we can branch off and get more variation, right? And Darwin, we can thank him because he was willing to be the front man on this idea, which at the time really needed somebody with his, I guess with his respect to really step out and put this idea forward as legitimate science. A contemporary of Darwin that I think is important for us to remember is Alfred Russel Wallace. So he was a little younger than Darwin, but lived at the same time. And Wallace also traveled to South America, and he collected a ton of specimens, and he was going to bring them back to Europe and show the scientists. So Alfred Russel Wallace was not from a gentleman's family. He was just a really curious poor guy who got a chance to go on an adventure, and a great, great thinker. So he's coming back from South America with all of his collections of new species and new ideas, and his ship catches on fire. Luckily he lives, but all of his collections are lost. So he's like, oh no, no one's gonna believe me. I have nothing to present. He ends up going down to Malaysia and living there, getting horrible malaria, but has this idea of evolution and natural selection, and he writes a letter to Darwin telling him about this idea, and it's as if Alfred Russel Wallace wrote the cliff notes to The Origin of Species. And at that time, Darwin had not published The Origin of Species yet. He was still mulling it over, and he would not bring it forth. But when he got this letter from Alfred Russel Wallace saying, I have this idea, at that point, Darwin said, yes, we have to move forward with this idea. And so together they moved forward with it. And it's just beautiful. Okay, so our understanding of evolution is that there is a common ancestor, right? And through the nature of life, mutations develop in DNA. That is, DNA just wants to be copied. As it is being copied, mistakes happen. Sometimes those mistakes make the living organism more fit for the environment. Sometimes those mistakes make it less fit. Sometimes those mistakes in DNA copying have no effect. Right, so you have these random mutations. There's also migration events, right, where there are new organisms coming into an environment and leaving an environment. So you have those factors. And then you have your environmental stress. So your environmental stress could be availability of water, availability of soil nutrients, right? We're thinking about plants. And that environmental stress, when resources are limited, creates natural selection, right? Which is the survival of the fittest. So those organisms that are able to reproduce the most are going to be the ones that have their DNA included in the next generation, and those that cannot reproduce as much won't have as much DNA in the next generation. Right? So it's the DNA is what is being passed between generations, but is the phenotype, the physical characteristics of the plant that are making it more competitive or less competitive, right? And so the DNA is what codes for those physical traits, and it's how those physical traits are expressed, makes it competitive or not, and then the DNA gets passed on. And those that don't get to pass their DNA on become extinct, right? So if an individual is unlucky or not fit for the environment, their DNA goes extinct. Right, so this is a speciation, though, is a gray area. So I think that biology in general is a gray area. Things are not black and white. Plants are not male or female or hermaphrodite. There's like a gray area. What a species is, because of evolution, we know there's this big gray area. And if you can imagine it, it's happened. But the idea of speciation, we like to, in order to talk about science or anything, putting things in finite categories makes it easier for us to discuss, right? And having discrete vocabulary, right? So species. Okay, so we have the biological species definition, and that would be if two organisms or two individuals can mate and produce a viable offspring, right? Or you have an ecological species definition, which is an organism that serves a specific place in a community, right? But so I'm not going to give you a specific definition that I want you to have for this, but realize that there is some, when you're talking about plant species, whether you are talking about their role in the environment or their biological ability to reproduce, are two different things. And within those specific things, there's some variation. So what I have here is I've drawn a cartoon of the ocean. We have, in light blue, we have our green island inside of the ocean. And we have the species living on the bank of this island. Then a mountain forms on our island, right? Which cuts the species off from moving to the other side. So the species starts to migrate around the edge of the island. As it's migrating, it's accumulating fat sideways mutation or tall mutations to the right, short mutations to the left, right? And then another million years pass and it mutates further in this direction, further in that direction, and so on and so forth until this species that was one on the north side of the island is now two species on the south side of the island. However, the species on the left could probably still mate going clockwise, and the species on the bottom right could probably still mate going counterclockwise. So if you had enough time in your laboratory or in your backyard, you could take the species on the bottom right and mate it to something maybe around 2 o'clock, and then that progeny you could mate to something at midnight. And vice versa, the species on the bottom left at 7 o'clock, you could mate to a species at 9 o'clock, and then mate that to the species at midnight. And so are indeed the species at 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock two different species? Arguable, right? Because you could, within a few generations, mate them back to each other. And this is something that is done in plant breeding today and has been done for a long time. And this is something that can still happen in the wild. While species are diverging, they can still cross, separate, cross, separate. So our idea of speciation is actually really complicated. It's not one ancestor, split, 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 split. It's split, merge, split, merge, split, merge. To complicate it further, there's also horizontal gene transfer, where one species can transfer its DNA into another species, and that DNA can stay there. So which sounds like genetic engineering or transgenics does happen in nature. All right, so that's pretty exciting stuff. Okay. Yeah, and because of, so this gray area of species, in plants it seems to be more forgiving than in animals, because plants have an ability to copy their DNA and have many, many copies of it. It's called polyploidization, and having those extra DNA copies, or that redundancy, allows them to evolve faster, because you can have one backup copy doing the life function that DNA is supposed to do, while the other one is evolving variation. And if that variation is deleterious, well, the backup copy is insurance, that one will still work. And if the new mutation is beneficial, then that will stick around, and that plant will become more successful, right? More fit for the environment. So all of that's exciting. Okay, this is the good schematic. So when we think about speciation and gene pool, so this is the biological speciation definition. We have plants that are the same species, so they are in the primary gene pool, which means 100% of the time when they mate, and they are going to produce viable, fertile offspring. Species that are considered in a secondary gene pool to the first one, they can maybe mate in one direction, or sometimes when they mate, they'll produce viable offspring, but not every time. So we could think about, in plants, there's a lot of examples, but in animals, the one that, because we are some of us animal-centric, if you have a horse and a donkey and you mate them and you get a mule, so the mule is not fertile, but you can get a mule pretty much every time, I think. I've never actually mated a donkey and a horse, but that's my understanding of it. And then you have the tertiary gene pool, which you may be able to combine the egg and the sperm from that and get an offspring, but only in very select circumstances. So that would be in a lab with growth media and stuff like that. Okay, so in nature, sometimes though, there are plants that are in the same primary gene pool, which could rub the flower parts together and get a very viable offspring, which don't actually mate in nature because they flower at different times, they're not geographically near each other, and other things. So you could take those, put them in a home garden or a greenhouse, and get them to mate and still have viable offspring. So why does this understanding of speciation, variation, evolution is good to keep in the back of your mind when, I think, when we're considering how we do home gardens, yards, agriculture, and preservation of wild germplasm. Because we want a whole bunch of genetic variation from that 600 million years of evolution, because that's really good insurance in case of climate change, because we don't know which of that genetic variation is going to be really good for us moving forward. So we want that as insurance and as backup, but when we, in recent times in our agriculture production and in our home gardens, we want to be able to predict how plants are going to grow, what they're going to yield, when they're going to flower. So we tend to plant cultivars that are monoculture or the same cultivar stuff. And so nature has this really good backup of genetic variation. And then we, in our controlled growing environments, have narrowed that genetic variation. And so we want to be careful that we don't narrow it too much. Maybe in our production agriculture and our home gardens, we could broaden that some. And we really need to preserve what is left in the wild, because that's our toolbox for the future moving forward. Yes, yes. All right, so we are getting into herbaceous plant ID. So there's, quick summary of the plant evolution. So when plants evolved seeds, that was great because they could be dispersed further. They have that dormant stage, which allows them to live through cold winters or dry summers in that dormant stage, and then grow when growing conditions are right. Seeds are also economically very important, so that gets people excited about them today. Some of the seed plants went to be the gymnosperms. The other seed plants came to be angiosperms. right? The angiosperms, those are the flowers. We are excited about flowers because they co-evolve with the pollinators, which help the whole system go around. And within the angiosperms, what we're talking about today are going to be our monocots and our eudicots, or our dicots, right? And for intro plants, we'll just say monocots and dicots, or we'll say even more simple, our grasses, which are our monocots, or our broadleaves, which are our dicots. So within the grass, there are lawn grass, our hay plants, corn is a grass, bamboo, lilies, right? And what those plants have that is similar to each other are a leaf that has parallel veins that's shaped somewhat like a sword, right? So that's a real easy identifier for grasses. And then the other plants, the broadleaves, or the eudicots, have leaves that have intersecting veins. So the veins, I don't know if this will work. I went out and picked some wildflowers this morning, but I don't think my webcam's good enough. Maybe. I'll have some images. So the veins of a plant are actually the vasculature. So that is where nutrients and water are flowing through the plant. Plants don't have a heart. They don't pump the nutrients and water through like animals do. Rather, the nutrients and water flow through, sometimes through evaporation of water going out through the leaves and then being sucked in through the roots. And other times the controlling of solutes going into a cell, because when there's more solutes, when there's more salt dissolved in a cell, then water rushes in to that plant cell, and that causes the plant cell to grow, producing turgor pressure going out. Imagine like you're filling a water balloon, and then that pressure moves nutrients through. So that's happening through the vasculature of the plant, which is important. And in grasses, that vasculature on the leaf blades is parallel, and on our broadleaves, the vasculature is intersecting. So that is a very easy way. And knowing whether you're looking at a grass or a broadleaf will help you to pretty much narrow down, because this is an exaggeration, but a good portion of plants are grasses, a good portion of plants are broadleaves. And if you know which of those you're looking at, that narrows down their evolutionary history, which is exciting. And I don't encourage use of, well, it comes up in class, all right? So in agriculture, herbicides are used, which are chemicals that kill plants. And there are herbicides that are specific for grasses, and there are herbicides that are specific for broadleaves. And that's because, and those can be designed that way because they have similar evolutionary pasts, they have similar biochemical makeup, and that's what the chemistry messes with. So that's kind of cool. Okay, so we are, this is my prettiest slide. I should have just done the whole talk with this up there. These are some photos that were taken by my neighbor, Jean Burrell, who works at Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve. She's a naturalist over there. And I said, Jean, what do I talk about? Because she does this every day. She tells people how to do plant IDs, and she knows all the medicinal traits and all the stories and the history. And I was like, I identify ag weeds. Okay, so she said, make sure you talk about the insects and the communities that are there. So that's what I want you all to be excited about. When you go out to identify your plants, don't just look at the plant as an isolated thing. Look at the plant in the environment. What kind of soil is it growing in? Is it sandy soil or rocky, or is it full of clay? Right? Is it in the shade? Is it wet? What else is on the ground? Is there moss growing around it? Is it leaf litter? Is it, are there other shrubs, shady or sunny, just shady part of the day? Okay, so that's kind of the environment there. But then what else is in the community? Are there other plants of the same size growing there? Is it always seen along with that other plant? And then are there pollinators there? Are there birds there? Because these plants, like what von Humboldt saw when he was climbing Mount Chimborazo, plants in Pennsylvania at Honey Hollow grow in specific ecological zones, and they grow in a plant community together. Those communities evolve as invasive species move through, or as disturbances happen. They'll change, but sometimes they'll go back to being the same. And part of what helps you identify plants is knowing if the environment you're looking in is where they're commonly found. So these are just I just think they're so beautiful. And what this is showing is that certain flowers have evolved shapes that promote pollination by shapes and colors that promote pollination by specific insects, birds, or bats, right? And the more specific the pollinator-flower interaction is, the more important that both have to be present in an ecosystem in order for pollination to happen, right? If you have a general pollinator, like the, this is a blue, I'm not gonna, and a Joe Pye weed, right? Pretty much any pollinator could come land on this. This would be pretty easy to pollinate, but this is less. So this means little of the pollen is not being transferred to flowers of similar shape, whereas much of this pollen could be transferred to any flower of any shape, vice versa. All right, so typical life cycle of it's a lot of words on this slide, Sarah. I should do more pictures and less words. So the typical life cycle of a plant is important to understand for understanding how our world works. Plants start as seeds. We'll start there. It's a circle, so you could really start it anywhere. Within a seed, you have the embryo, which is going to be the next generation, and you have storage material or reserves, right? So that is why seeds are so nutritious. That's why we eat our wheat, our corn, our beans, because of that nutrient reserve that is in there is just packed with nutrients. Well, those same nutrients that we as humans can digest to get energy from, the seed is going to also digest, the embryo is going to digest in order to grow. So you plant a seed underground, or a seed is planted underground, and the embryo, as it imbibes water and starts to digest that storage tissue, and grows, it germinates, and then establishes a seedling. That's when the plant reaches the soil surface and can start photosynthesizing. That's a really cool change in how the plant is acting, because until it is established, it is burning energy than what it, which had been stored in the seed, and once it's established, it is then going to be making energy. Okay, then you have your mature plant. Okay, sorry, back it up. Okay, so then you have your seedling. It grows vegetatively. You have your juvenile plant, produces all the green parts, the stems, the leaves. And then you hit maturity, right? So plant puberty, anthesis, right? Where the meristem, that growth point, switches from growing vegetatively, that immature tissue, into growing reproductive tissue. So that's neat because they don't always have the reproductive tissue there. It's not like humans that are born with eggs. No, a plant grows immature, has some switch where it produces a flower. So flowers come, think of plant puberty. The flower then needs to be pollinated, and then, which is the movement of the pollen from one flower, from the male flower part onto the female flower part. After pollination, you have fertilization. And then if fertilization goes right, then you get the seed. So the typical life cycle of the plant is seed, germination, seedling, vegetative plant, mature flowering plant, pollination, fertilization, and repeat. And so we need the insects and birds in our environment to do that. We need the plants to be there feeding them. Okay, the big difference between our, some of the large differences between our monocots, which are our grasses again, and our dicots. We went over the parallel veins or the intersecting veins. They also do have different, when they germinate, monocots tend to shoot up a single cotyledon, which will look like a single blade of grass, and dicots have two cotyledons, which look like two kind of succulent leaves that come up out of the ground first. So if you're trying to ID young plants, they will look different just as they sprout, whether they're a grass or a broadleaf. If you look at the vascular system under a microscope, you'll see different organization and patterns. Their roots have evolved a little bit differently. And then the flower petal number has also evolved differently because the monocots broke off from the dicots so long ago and their evolution has diverged. For intro plant ID though, I think that the leaf veins are the easiest to go with. So this is a pretty typical cartoon of flower anatomy. Flower anatomy has the outer sepals, which are usually a green layer that helps to protect the bud or the flowering plant. Then you have an inner whorl, that one row in, which is the petals. The petals are the decorative portion of the plant. They are there to attract a pollinator. Inside the petal whorl, you have your male reproductive organ, right? So that's where the pollen is going to be produced. Pollen contains the sperm. And then inside of that, in the very center of the flower, you'll have your female reproductive part. So that's 4 whorls. You have the outer sepal protective whorl, the petal, which is the decorative whorl, the male whorl, which produces the pollen, and the female whorl, which at the bottom have the ovaries. Okay. Very simplified view of a flower, when in reality, because they've been co-evolving with pollinators for so long, they have evolved very different decorative petals to attract different things, different shaped petals, so that the proboscis or the beak or the legs of the pollinator can interact with the pollen that's going to have the sperm in it, and with the female reproductive part, which has the egg at the bottom. And what's pretty neat is that some flowers are male only, some flowers are female only, and some flowers are hermaphrodites. And within a plant, you could have some that are male, some plants that are female, some plants that are hermaphrodite, and some plants that will change over their lifetime depending on the environmental stress. So just adding to this gray area of plant evolution. All right. Grass anatomy. So I do not expect you in this first lesson, those of you who are already familiar with plants might be familiar with the vocabulary, but what I would recommend if you've never gone out plant IDing is to bring a cheat sheet of plant part anatomy vocabulary. A grass flower is called a spike, or the inflorescence is often spikes or spikelets. They can come in different shapes. Flowers can come in a lot of shapes. You have a flag leaf, which is the leaf that pulls away from the stem. You have the collar area on the grass, which is the area where the leaf blade, which is away from the stem, and the leaf sheath, which wraps around the stem, unite, and that's the collar. And besides the flower on grasses, the collar area is unique and can be used for plant identification. So for intro grass ID, look at the collar and look at the flower. Okay, so zooming into the collar, we have a more realistic and a more cartoony view, but I think both can help. So imagine that the center stem was pulled out, and what we have in the back here is the leaf blade, which is the loose part of the leaf that flops away from the stem. And then below the blade, we have the leaf sheath, which wraps around the stem. So right at the collar region, there are 2 distinct features. We have the auricles, which means ear, and that's kind of what it looks like when they appear. They're kind of rare, but they're very distinct when they're there, or they look like cat claws wrapping around, or the edge of a collar, right? Like the lapels on a collar. So this would be, if I were a grass, these would be my auricles. And then the ligule is the back of the collar. So then this would be my ligule. And the ligule can be membranous, it can be hairy, it can be long, it could be absent, it could be cleft. Right, but this feature, which I think many of us, prior to teaching weed ID, I know all grasses just look the same to me. But now you can go out and you can look and you can see like different beautiful variation in a grass field. It's fantastic, just by looking at the collar, even before the seed head or the flower forms. Oops. Another defining feature about grasses, which is good to know for management reasons, is that some grasses are bunch grasses. They grow because of their stem structures, which are primarily vertical. They grow together and make a tall bunch stand. Or you have creeping sod-forming grasses, which has horizontal stems called rhizomes or stolons. And when those stems lay down on the ground at their nodes, they can grow new roots. And then that grass is really good for preventing erosion and weed control and stuff like that. So when you dig up and rhizomes, these horizontal stems, or these kind of engorged root looking things, are another feature that helps for plant identification. So it's not just the flowery above ground parts, it's also these functional below ground parts. Okay. So for grass ID, learn the parts of the collar and some recognizable seed head stuff. For broadleaf ID, the basic anatomy, I think for getting started, is here. All right, so you have the node, excuse me, the node is the joint. we'll say, where the leaves or other branches are coming off. The inner node is the space in between. An axillary bud is a bud or a growth that is coming off on the side. The positioning of the leaves on the nodes is helpful. Alternate is when there's one leaf at nodes, but they're coming off, on different sides. And then opposite are 2 leaves per node on opposite sides. And whorled are many leaves per node coming off on sort of a spray. And that's a great place to start identification. Here, okay. So a dichotomous key, this only works when we're doing it in person, but a dichotomous key is a system of this or that statements. So looking in the weeds of the Northeast, it starts out simply. Are you looking at a grass or are you looking at a broadleaf? I'm looking at a broadleaf. Okay, if you're looking at a broadleaf, are you looking at one with alternate leaves or one with opposite leaves? I'm looking at one with opposite leaves. So, okay, then looking at the leaf, are the margins, which is the edge, are they serrated or are they smooth? And so on and so forth. So knowing the anatomy and the adjectives that describe each of those anatomy, the descriptor words, you can work your way through the book, and it says, well, you're probably looking at this plant or you're looking at that plant. And the glossary of the anatomical terms are in the backs of the plant ID books, so you don't have to have them all memorized when you start. Yeah, and so that's it. So practice using a dichotomous key. To practice, start with plants that you already know what they are. So something easy like a dandelion or a goldenrod, right, which are out right now, because that helps you gain familiarity with the terms. Right, so some of the 2 big ones that are out right now, which are doing great things for our pollinators, are our asters, which look like clusters of small daisy-like flowers. They can be white, pink, purple, blue. There are many native species to the area here, and there's also some that have been naturalized, and there are cultivars that people grow in their gardens as well. So asters are out and about. They can range between 1 and 8 feet tall. There are some species that need full sun, some species that'll grow in partial shade. So they are the white and purple flowers you see along the side of the road right now. It's a few different images of them. This is the aromatic aster, which is one of the shorter ones. The common blue wood aster, which has an incredible amount of flowers clumped close together. The New York aster, and I just included, I thought this was a sweet butterfly, and this butterfly lays its larva on the asters. So plants that are flowering this time of year are particularly important for the environment because during the winter, there's not a lot of pollen or nectar sources for the insects. And so they need to really stock up. So late fall blooming is important. New England aster are those that tend to have the darker purple flowers around here. And then goldenrods. Goldenrods, which again, do not cause hay fever, are in bloom. They are tall plants that have a beautiful arc to them with a fantastic spray of small yellow flowers. Both the goldenrod and the asters are in the Asteraceae family, which is distinguished by its symmetrical flowers. A lot of our showy flowers are Asteraceaes. Okay, and to not leave out a grass. So grasses, I think, for plant identification are intimidating to beginners because they don't have the showy flower, which is so often used for ID. The Indian wood oats does have a very distinct seed head. It looks like a flattened seed head, and you'll see those around now. All right, so in conclusion, when you are out doing your plant identification, I think you'll get more enjoyment and more excitement out of it. If you look at the whole community, not just the plant you're trying to ID, but what else grows in that environment with it. What is the growing environment? The soil, the light, the moisture. Are there other insects or birds interacting with it? Is there insect damage on it? Are there nests on it? Are there praying mantis nests on it, right? Do study some of the anatomy, but make sure you're doing those first things and getting excited about what's going on out there before you get bogged down in the anatomy. And I hope that after today, everybody knows the difference between a grass and a broadleaf and that they are evolutionarily quite different. All right. Thank you all for joining, and good luck on the BioBlitz.
Thank you so much, Sarah. If anyone has any questions, you can either unmute yourself or type it in the chat. So if anyone wants to do that, and then I'm just going to do a quick, push again for the BioBlitz. We will be using, I know Sarah mentioned at the beginning that there are a lot of different apps that you can use to help you identify plants, and iNaturalist, which is the one we're using for the BioBlitz, is a great one. So I highly recommend everyone download it, have fun with it. Even if you don't do the BioBlitz, it's just a fun app to use, and it helps you identify things that you didn't know what they were. And it's very, very cool. Definitely, though, sign up for the BioBlitz if you have some time during that last week. I guess it's not last week, the 18th to the 24th of October. And just come out and have some fun. Even if you don't want to do the BioBlitz, come out. Our grounds are open dawn to dusk every day. Come out, enjoy. This is a great time of year to look at the plants. As Sarah mentioned, there's some great flowering plants in the fall that are just really cool. And we have a lot of them, especially in our meadow areas, which are normally too hot to really go and explore, but it's beautiful this time of year to go and explore them. So definitely come out and take part. All righty. Any questions before we finish up?
Okay, the question is, can you tell us a little more about how plants hold unmutated genes back when mutations occur? I will try. That's a really great question. We don't completely understand it, right? So in basic animal genetics, you have two copies of the chromosomes, one from the male parent, one from the female parent. One can be dominant, one can be recessive, or they can both be being expressed simultaneously and creating a phenotype that's in between those. Right? So in plants, there are multiple copies of the genome, and it appears that if one of the copies is not functioning, then another copy will act and compensate for that and produce whatever protein or biochemical thing needs to be produced. If a deleterious mutation does evolve, which rather than being a loss of function is actually a aggressive poor function, such as like a disease, an autoimmune disorder, right? I don't think plants have those, but you could imagine something in parallel with a plant. If the mutation was aggressively deleterious, then good genes could not compensate for it. But if that deleterious mutation is just a loss of function, then that can persist until it evolves into maybe a gain of function. So for a specific example, we'll say we have genes, plants have genes that for photosynthesis, right? And so you can imagine if there were two copies of that photosynthesis gene and one of them stopped working, the other one could continue photosynthesizing without that other one. And that one that stopped working because of the mutation could then accumulate other mutations while the first gene is still functioning. And if by chance it accumulates some mutation that allows it to double its photosynthetic rate, then all of a sudden that new mutation makes it more competitive. Does that answer your question, Luke? All right. I had one other recommendation for an intro plant ID book. It's actually the Wildflowers of the Audubon Society. And it's nice because it separates by flower color, which is a really non-intimidating way for new plant people to get out there. The Weeds of the Northeast is nice because it does it by vegetative parts, which people have plant blindness to, but once you get over that, it's very useful for plants at any developmental stage. But once they're flowering, the Audubon book is very user-friendly.
All righty, fabulous. Yes, well, Sarah, again, thank you so much great information. And anyone who wants to watch this again, it will be again posted up on YouTube in the next couple of days. And we're really excited you're coming. Hopefully everyone will come next week when I believe Dennis and Luke, who are actually both on today, are going to be talking about fungus and lichen, which we're very excited about. And again, please sign up for our BioBlitz. We're really excited about having it. So again, thank you all very much, and we'll hope to see you all soon.